Hey guys, welcome to another week's episode of GetPsyched, and this week we're going to be taking a look at the neurology of mental health and the role that the brain plays in our mental well-being. I think often, particularly on GetPsyched and in society as a whole, we look at how things like cultural context or society or our relationships or other people influence our mental health and our mental well-being. Sometimes though we can forget the role that neurology plays. We can forget the chemical imbalances in the brain that go on, often that lead to mental illnesses. So this week we're going to be taking a look at that topic. We often hear, I think particularly in the mental health realm, for maybe people that don't know what they're really talking about, say things like, you're in control of your brain, so therefore you can control your thoughts and you can control what the brain does. Well, actually, in truth, science tells us something very different. And actually, it's very difficult to control areas of the brain and impossible to control other parts. If you look at somebody with a brain injury, for example, and we're going to take a look at this analogy later on in the video, but if you look at somebody with a brain injury, they're going to have certain limitations. Those may be physical limitations, they may be cognitive limitations. Similar situations kind of go on when somebody is experiencing a mental illness. There are neurological limitations that stop that person from experiencing things that might benefit them with regards to their mental well-being. So we can start to see the really important role that these chemical imbalances, or the really important role that the brain and neurology plays with regards to our mental well-being. Also, before we go any further, guys, make sure to hit the like button on today's video. You can comment any questions that you've got and I'll be sure to get back to you. You can also share the video, and if you're enjoying GetPsyched as a whole, make sure to hit the subscribe button. You can hit that little bell next to the subscribe button and get weekly reminders every time I upload. Anyway, let's get into the video. We perhaps know different areas of the brain and some parts of their functionality. We might know parts like the different lobes, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe at the back of the brain. Its functionality is to do with sight primarily. But we know also that some of these areas of the brain have got real implications for our mental well-being. For example, the amygdala, which is that little almond part of the brain, almond-shaped part of the brain. It's not made of almond, obviously, but it's like an almond shape in the middle of the brain. That's like our kind of primal emotional center. That's like our kind of fight, flight, or freeze center. And we also have the prefrontal cortex, which informs us of what to do next. Like, it informs our decision making, or it's the kind of construction of balances of options. It's also the area primarily for personality. And we use that kind of area to inform decisions. And you can start to see a little bit here that if you've got a flight response or a fear response to something that's based in the amygdala, your prefrontal cortex might utilize that to inform you on decisions. I'm often thinking on a wavelength here with mental illness with regards to somebody maybe who's experiencing illness of agoraphobia. They may have a fear or flight complex when it comes to getting outside, and their prefrontal cortex might inform them that it's not safe. That's an imbalance going on there, because often it is safe to go outside. And one of the treatment processes that we might do with somebody who's experiencing agoraphobia is to look at the neurology there and make sense of what the brain is actually trying to tell that individual to do. When we do that, we can often gain a little bit of psychoeducation and say, do you know what, we need to try and change this chemical imbalance if we can to some degree, and inform ourselves that actually, do you know what, the amygdala can chill out a little bit. It doesn't need to scare us so much. It doesn't need to tell us that the outside is so scary. And our prefrontal cortex, our frontal lobe, can inform us and make appropriate decisions, and decisions that make sense, that are good for our mental well-being. We also have areas like the hippocampus, which stores memories. It's kind of like the center for our memories. And I often think the hippocampus is a really important part when it comes to mental illness and mental well-being, because so often we have really kind of negative memories, or memories when things went wrong in the past, or situations that happened to us, whether or not they're fabricated in our minds or whether that actually did happen. They have real influence on how our mental well-being is formed today. So I think the hippocampus plays a really important role with regards to mental well-being. I know I've made it sound quite like the brain has got different silos, like it's got different parts. This part does this part doesn't do that, but it does this. This lobe is responsible for this part or this thing. And actually, the brain doesn't really work like that. Neurology doesn't tell us that. Neurology says that the brain works together as a whole. it bounces ideas off one another, and it's connected in so many different ways. We can understand this via the neurons that utilize electroconnectivity to communicate different messages to different parts of the brain and different lobes. And we can understand this better by the neurons and the axons that communicate those messages. So we can understand that, if there's issues with those neurons or issues with those axons, that actually, those messages can get relayed in an incorrect manner, and actually the connections can be wrong. And we can also understand that if those connections are wrong and those communications are wrong, we can start to see some impacts on our mental health and mental well-being. Now, when there's an issue with the electroconnectivity in the brain via the neurons, via the neurotransmitters and the axons that communicate different messages between the lobes and different parts of the brain, when there's an issue there, we can start to see issues with mental health and mental well-being. But how do those issues in neurotransmitters and the communication between the neurons actually happen? Well, things like family genetics, if we're thinking again about the neurological role of the brain's role in our mental well-being and mental illness and mental health, the role that family genetics play is a big one. You're more likely to experience depression and anxiety if you have a direct family member who's experienced depression and anxiety. The same goes for schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, for example, has got like a 70 to 80% chance that if a mother or a father has experienced schizophrenia, then you're going to experience a 70 to 80% chance. So there's a really high family genetic factor here that we can't ignore. Also, things like work stress or even brain injury as well. These are the kind of things that can have impacts on those neurotransmitters that can then therefore result in mental health issues and mental illness. Now, of course, there are other reasons as to why these neurotransmitters or these connections might be off a little bit. But ultimately today we're looking at that neurological impact, and we're looking at the ways in which the brain might be influenced, or those chemical imbalances might actually happen that therefore might result in mental health difficulties. Now, one of the things that we really need to understand when it comes to neurology and mental health and mental wellness is the chemical imbalances that go on in our brains. And those chemical imbalances are really important when we're thinking about those electroconnections that go on between the different parts of the brains via the neurons, via the neurotransmitters that help us relay communications and different informations and messages between the different parts of the brain. Now, one of those main chemicals that are utilized to effectively transmit those messages is glutamate. And glutamate is utilized within the neurons, within the neurotransmitters and the axons to communicate those messages appropriately. And if somebody doesn't have enough glutamate, then those messages aren't getting across well enough. If we look at our example again of somebody with agoraphobia, the amygdala is going to maybe inform that person that it's scary to go outside, that something might happen. Maybe I heard something on the news of crime on the increase, and outside now seems really, really scary. The amygdala is telling us, it's giving us that kind of fight or fright response, and telling us, it's quite scary outside. The message is getting relayed to the prefrontal cortex or the frontal lobe that helps us inform appropriate decisions is a little bit off. So ultimately, what might happen is we might end up just staying inside. That decision dedicated to the prefrontal cortex is saying, do you know what, we're not going outside, this is the best option, we're going to stay in. That's not beneficial for that individual's mental health or mental well-being. And you can start to see that the connections, those chemical imbalances that have an impact on the way in which communication is relayed between different parts of the brain is ultimately going to have an impact on how we feel. Now, I've made that sound very basic and very straightforward. That's not always the case, of course. And like we said, neurology in the brain is something we're still learning about. It's something very, very complex, and not everybody with agoraphobia has got a reduced amount of glutamate that's having an impact on those chemical connections, but it's something to be looking at, I think. Studies have shown that people with really severe depression, anxiety, OCD and schizophrenia do naturally have a lower rate of glutamate, and therefore are going to experience challenges when it comes to different parts of the brain communicating appropriate messages. So we can start to see that actually the neurology in the brain is playing a huge role in the way in which mental illnesses and mental health difficulties are being perpetuated for people. One of my final points when it comes to understanding the neurology of mental health and the role that the brain plays in mental illness, believe me, we could talk for days on this. I think we have to talk about serotonin. Now, this is a chemical that happens in the brain where it's a kind of our feel-good chemical. It's the kind of thing that we need in order for us to feel good. Now, people with depression, people with anxiety, people with an array of different mental health difficulties often naturally, or not necessarily naturally, but at the time have a lower level of serotonin. And ultimately this can be like a perpetual cycle, because people with lower serotonin often do things and have issues in other parts of their lives that can lead to more issues with mental health. So for example, lack of serotonin is pretty stereotypical with people with depression. It's also pretty expected with people who have issues with their sleep cycles. It can influence our circadian rhythm and our release of melatonin when we sleep. It has a real impact on our sleep quality and our sleep cycle. And we know also the relationship between depression and lack of sleep. If there's not enough sleep or if there's not enough quality sleep, often depressive symptomologies can perpetuate. So we can see here that serotonin and the role of serotonin is really important when it comes to depression. One of the main ways that we can understand serotonin and the important role that this plays within the brain when it comes to depression is via the use of antidepressant medication. Now there's many different families of antidepressant medication, but the main one is SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And what they do basically is they influence the spread of serotonin between neurons via a process called reuptake. Within each neuron, there is a protein called the transporter that fundamentally moves serotonin from one neuron to the next via the synaptic cleft. And what happens therefore is that the serotonin is being reuptake within the next neuron. Now, SSRIs stop that process. They allow more serotonin to be present within the synaptic cleft, and therefore there's more serotonin going on in the brain. With more serotonin, we know that there can be a reduction in depression and people can start to feel a little bit better. So this is where the antidepressant medication really gives us information and really solid evidence for the role that neurology and the brain actually plays on mental illness and mental well-being. Now, I know not everybody is very keen on antidepressant medication, and actually I'm going to pop a video above my head here where we looked at the role of antidepressant medication within therapy, and we looked at it compared to therapy. It's a really good video. It might give you a little bit more information on SSRIs as well. But we can start to see here that actually, if these SSRIs are influencing the chemical imbalance in our brain and influencing the amount of these hormones or chemicals that we're experiencing in the brain, then neurology plays a really, really important role when it comes to our mental well-being. Okay guys, that's pretty much all I've got right now on the neurology of mental health and mental wellness and the role that the brain plays when it comes to mental health and mental well-being. I really hope that you've enjoyed today's video, guys. This has been a kind of informative video. Often we look at top tips and things like that about how to move forward in the development of your mental health. But today we're doing a little bit of an informative video, and I really hope it helps you consider a little bit about how the brain and neurochemistry influences our mental well-being, and not just things like society and our context and our relationships, as important as those things are. If you have enjoyed today's video, guys, then make sure to hit that like button. You can comment on the video and I'll be sure to get back to you. And if you've been enjoying GetPsyched as a whole, make sure to hit the subscribe button, and you can hit that little bell next to the subscribe button and get weekly reminders every time I upload. Thank you so much for watching again, guys, and hopefully catch you next week.